All right, everybody, we are back and we are talking about chapter 7. Chapter 7 is a biggie. We're talking fluids, water, and electrolytes. And at the beginning of the class, what we said was that athletes need more of two things. They need more calories and they need more fluid. So we're going to talk about the second part of that, which is more fluid. And so let's get into this. And so just a couple of nutrition basics here. We know that half to three-fourths of our body consists of water, and water has all these important functions for us. A lot of times it doesn't get much credibility. It doesn't get much love. When you talk about macronutrients, right? Macros, everyone's talking about macros, the carbs, fats, proteins, but really water is a macro if you want to think about it. But because it doesn't provide us calories, like I said, it doesn't get much love, but water does a lot of important things, carries nutrients to your cells and waste away from the body. It regulates body temperature. It dissolves vitamins and minerals, other nutrients. It lubricates your joints. I mean, I could have asked you to pop that in the chat, but when you look at water, I think this is from the Nutrition 101 piece, right? We've got how we get the fluid in and then how we get the fluid out. And that's going to be an important piece of this as we get in later this chapter. But again, the most common way you get fluid in is through what you drink, right? But don't forget that you've got water in the foods you eat. And then we also produce through metabolism what we call metabolic water. And then how we get it out, like the most common way is through urine. But then as we exercise, we're going to sweat. And then respiration is another way that we get the fluid out. And that's why you end up losing a pound or two overnight, is because you're breathing. And when you breathe, you lose that water vapor. And then you also lose a little through the feces. But in general, we tend to say you need 10 to 13 cups. And what we'll really get into in this chapter is around exercise. And so remember, when we say 10 to 13 cups, this is for your baseline needs. Everybody following that? That's your baseline needs, 10 to 13 cups. You're going to need more fluid when we start talking about before, during, and after exercise. All right. That's just for baseline. So with that being said, let's get into the material, because what we know is that too great of water losses will negatively impact your performance. And what we also know, and I don't have this on the slide, is if you consume too much fluid, too much water, that will also give you problems. There's a condition. Anybody, have you heard of this? Oh, okay. So this is good for me to know. Karen says module 3 is not open. Well, we got to fix that. Let's fix that right now. We know that anybody in the chat, type in the chat if you have heard of the condition hyponatremia. My guess is you probably haven't. Now, some of you have. Okay, good. All right. I want to make this available. And good point on module 3. The dates may be a little off, but just know the material's in there, and I'll go back in and make sure everything's set correctly. Thanks for letting me know. I must have done this for my graduate class and not my undergraduate class, because this semester I'm teaching grad and undergrad sports nutrition. So sorry if I left y'all hanging, but it should be up, and I'll come back and update all the dates and things. But the truth is, it's open now until the end of the semester, which I think our last class date is like the 7th of December. So that should be good now. All right. Everybody seeing my screen? So you still should be able to see and so electrolytes are also important. We'll talk about what electrolytes are here in a minute. And what the bottom line is now is that as an athlete, and even just a recreational exerciser, you need to have an individualized plan. Too often you hear recommendations that are broad But you've got to always figure out what's going to work for you. And let's see. See if I can find these. I got people in the waiting room. Somebody's saying, but I don't see anybody. Okay. Having a little waiting room problem. Let me try this again. I don't see anybody. Hold up. Yeah, I don't see anybody. All right, maybe that was an earlier comment. It's not showing me anybody in the waiting room. But if I'm missing somebody, I'm sorry. I'm recording, so we'll see if anybody is okay. Yeah, okay. So now I see somebody now. Good deal. But we need to individualize this fluid plan along with the calories too before, during, and after exercise. And we talked about that. The same thing applies for fluid intake. And I want to show you this image. And I usually would draw this on the board, but what you see is something called euhydration. Euhydration just means that you're adequately hydrated. And on one end, you've got hypohydration. This is what we know as low fluid, right? Low fluid water volume. And then you've got hyperhydration, which means you're overhydrated. And like I said, you can get into trouble on both ends of the spectrum. Like I said, hyponatremia is when there's a condition where you're overhydrated. You consume too much fluid. And then usually what we say, type in the chat, what our most common term, what do we use when we say we're low in fluid? It's not on this slide. What do we call it? Dehydration, yes. So here's what I want you to know. Write this down. So dehydration is the process of becoming hypohydrated. There's a technical difference here. You know, dehydration means you're just a little under what you need. Hypohydration means you're so low that it's going to start to really affect your performance. Okay, so but dehydration is the process of becoming hypohydrated. Most of the time we just use the two terms synonymously, but there's a little bit of a technical difference there. Okay. And then let's just define what an electrolyte is. Somebody in the chat, type in, what does an electrolyte? What does that mean? Electrolyte. You see them here, right? You've got all of the most common that we talk about is sodium and potassium. And we also talk about a little bit about magnesium. But what is an electrolyte? What does it have? Type in the chat. Anybody? So an electrolyte, anybody? Has a charge. That's right. Has a charge. Gabby, you got it. And that charge could be positive and that charge could be negative. And so that's what you're seeing here is that if it's a positive charge, they're called cations. And if it has a negative charge, it's called anions. But again, most of the ones we tend to talk about are sodium, potassium, magnesium, calcium. We don't talk much about, we focus on calcium around bone. But when we talk about sweat, believe it or not, you do lose a little calcium through your sweat. So, and then there are others over here, bicarbonate and phosphorus, but basically it has a charge. And these charges are important. And this is where I would typically draw on the board and say, what are these electrolytes important for? We talk about fluid balance, but what does that really mean? And basically it's when you talk about, anybody heard of action potentials? An action potential, basically, it's what drives that impulse down the nerve. And essentially all that is the switching of sodium and potassium along the membrane of a nerve or muscle. If you studied that, you studied muscle physiology, like you talked about your neuromuscular junction, right, with a nerve. So basically all you're doing, and it's hard for me just to talk this through, but essentially, you've got sodium, and you can type this in the chat. Is sodium found more on the outside of the cell or inside of the cell? Anybody? 50-50 chance. Anybody? Outside or inside the cell? Where do you find the most of it? I'll just give it to you. It's outside the cell. And then with potassium, more potassium is inside the cell. So what we end up seeing is, if you were to put like a voltmeter inside the cell, what you tend to see, like if you see the drawings, you'll see all the pluses on the outside of the cell. If you remember, if you looked at a drawing where you've seen all the pluses on the outside and all the negatives on the inside, all that means is that the outside of the cell is more positively charged than the inside. Because think about this, potassium is also a positively charged, it's a cation, so is sodium. But while on the inside of the cell that you see it negative along that membrane, it's just because there's just a less of a charge. But what ends up happening is when sodium rushes into the cell, then it becomes more positive. That's an action potential. And then potassium runs outside the cell. And that change along the membrane of a nerve as well as a muscle leads to that action potential. So these are important for sure. All right, I just wanted to mention what these electrolytes are. Okay. So what determines how much body water you have? Well, several factors. One is that bigger people tend to have, it makes sense, right? Tend to have more body water. So then males tend to have more body water than females, because in most cases, you look at big football linemen, they're going to be bigger. Not always, but generally it's the case. Males tend to have more body water. Age will affect it. The younger you are, they have more body water. As you get older, you have less muscle, you got less water in your cells, and so you tend to have more trouble with hydration as you get older. Also, like I said, body composition affects it. So leaner individuals have more body water. And in general, this is for like a 70 kilogram male, you got about 42 liters of water. Females end up having about 30 respectively. But again, the bottom line, it just depends on how big you are and how much muscle you have and your age in general. Like this picture here, this gal who's doing some kind of weight training class here, she's smaller than the guy behind her. So she's going to probably have less body water. And this is one of the reasons too, we need to individualize all this stuff. And when we look at the fluid and how it's distributed, I usually ask this as a trick question or even a quiz question in class, with total body water, do you have more of your fluid inside the cell or outside the cell? And from this illustration, you can see that you've got way more fluid inside the cell than outside. Inside the cell, intracellularly. you do have fluid that's outside the. But think about all the billions of cells you have. So, and they have various amounts of fluid in them. But in general, like when we think of muscle cell, there's a lot of fluid inside these muscle cells, a lot of water. And then extracellular fluids, you have stuff that's for instance, an example of extracellular fluid would be the fluid that you find in your bloodstream, the plasma, if you will, and the fluid in between your cells, and in what they call interstitial fluid. But in general, you're going to see that you have more fluid inside the cell than outside the cell. And they try to do, I don't know what page this is on in your text, but they try to relate it to bottles of sports bottles, I guess. And so if you got 42 liters, like we just described a couple slides ago for a male, 28 of those liters, like we got 28 liter bottles here, are intracellular, and 14 of these water bottles are going to be extracellular. So you got some that are in between the cells, interstitial, and then you got some that's in the blood as also. So just to kind of put that in perspective. All right, so let's get into the fluid recommendations. And again, as with the last chapters, this is the most important part, right? Because we want to know, what are the recommendations before, during, and after exercise? So we know it's going to be important to hydrate before, during, and after. And the question is, how much? It's probably not as much as you think, especially before. Like, in big like marathons and Ironmans, you hear people, and even maybe in some of your sporting events, anybody ever heard that, I need to start hydrating like 3 days before my event? Anybody heard that before? Type in the chat if you've heard that before. And I'm thinking, no, that's probably one of the worst things you could do, is because you're going to be up all night peeing. And you don't need to overdo. Yes, you need to stay hydrated, but you don't need to over. And in some instances, more is not better. Okay. So we know that if you are dehydrated and you become hypohydrated, it's definitely going to negatively affect your strength and speed and endurance and energy and cognitive processing. I'm sure some of you have athletic trainers in here, maybe work with folks, or you've seen folks who are so hypohydrated or dehydrated that they don't know where they are. They lose processing. They get dizzy. You may have seen that before, but again, that's in extreme cases. That we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into heat related stuff. Okay, but we know it definitely is a factor. You can run out of energy, but then you also, just as important, is you can become dehydrated and hypohydrated. That will severely affect your performance negatively. And so again, baseline needs 10 to 13 cups. And so this is just showing you what ends up happening. So we've got someone running for, what is that, 2 hours on a treadmill, I guess, or exercising for 2 hours. And this is their, this is rectal temperature. That's exactly what it says. And this is what we used to do back in the day, is they would put a thermometer up the other end. I'm not making this up. And they could measure your core body temperature. That's how they used to do it. Nowadays, there's more sophisticated methods to do that. But when I was a grad student, an exercise physiology lab, we did a rectal temperature lab where we had a thermometer. That's one of those where you're like, I don't really want to volunteer for that lab. But here's what you get. Right, when over time, for folks who are hydrating adequately, what you tend to see is, yes, the core temperature will go up, but it stabilizes. But for people who aren't hydrating, what you end up happening is that your core body temperature just continues to rise, which at some point will start to affect your performance. So let's get into the guidelines. Here's what you need: 5 to 10 milliliters of fluid per kilogram of body weight. And I just got this into pounds, milliliters, 2 to 5 milliliters per pound, a couple hours before. I've got 4 hours before, because what you would like to do is you would like to become adequately hydrated and then let your body excrete the excess so that when your competition starts, you're ready to go. And that's the worst thing that could happen is if you were in a, and you may have seen this in a basketball game or some other type of sport where an athlete is overhydrated, they're running back to the back. You see them leave the field and be like, where are they going? Well, they're going to the bathroom, right? Because they've probably either eaten too much, maybe their stomach's nervous, or maybe they just had too much to drink and they got to go to the bathroom. So this is not that much fluid when you look at this. So an example is you've got this 150-pound person. If we take the middle of the road number, say 7 milliliters times their body weight in kilograms, that's 476 milliliters of fluid. And I'm going to type in the chat here because here's a conversion that you're going to need to know. 1 cup of fluid is 240 milliliters. Okay. So then if you have 476, that's right about 2 cups. Right. So, and you know this. So 1 cup equals 8 ounces equals 240 milliliters. So these are kind of the conversions, some things that you need to know. Everybody good with this? Type in the chat, give me a thumbs up, say, yep, I'm good with these numbers. So a couple of cups of fluid is not that big a deal, right? There's no reason to go take your big gallon of Gatorade and just chug it, you know, because you're trying to stay hydrated. You don't need to do that. Couple of cups over, you know, a couple hours before should be fine. So this is the guideline. And what we could do in class, and I would encourage you, I'm not going to have you do this now, is you could just calculate that for yourself, you know, 5 to 10, and use those two numbers. It's probably going to come up similar to this individual. It's going to be, you know, a cup to 3 cups of fluid before exercise. Yeah. So just take your body weight in kilograms and multiply by 5 and multiply by 10, and then convert that into ounces or cups, or to see how much you need. It's not as much as you might think. And it's just something you need to pay attention to. Everybody okay with this? And so what does adequately hydrated look like? We'll talk about this in just a minute, but your urine should be relatively clear. It may be a little pale, but that's another way, because this is a starting point to give you the numbers. And then you have to figure out, like we talked about before, kind of make it individualized. And then during exercise, everybody good with before? During exercise is pretty interesting, because ideally what you would like to do is to match your sweat rate. But that's not always the case. If it's really hot and humid, it's going to be impossible for some of us who are heavy sweaters. So if it's hot and humid, it's going to be pretty much impossible to do that. And if you're a heavy sweater, that just adds to it. Or you could be in a cool climate with low humidity. So that can affect it as well, where you're not sweating much at all. And just because you're not sweating doesn't mean, okay, I don't need to hydrate. No, you do. So this is where the individualization really comes into play. And so the old, and if you look at the PDFs, I've kind of changed this up a little bit, but this is the old recommendation. The old recommendation was for you to drink 8 to 10 ounces. This is during exercise. I'm not making this up. 8 to 10 ounces of fluid, cold fluid, or sports drink every 15 minutes. So if someone actually followed this guideline, and this is why you really need to question, some of the things you look at and read and guidelines, that would mean someone would consume 40 ounces per hour. And for most people, that's too much. "40 ounces an hour." This guideline, if you go back and study where it came from University of Texas, which, lots of great research came out of the University of Texas. But what they did was they put elite cyclists in a hot room with no fan. So they put these folks in here, and then they measured how much they sweat. And so for them to stay hydrated, they needed 8 to 10 ounces every 15 minutes. That's great for them. But for most of us, we don't need that much. And actually, this is where, if you look into this, where people started getting into hyponatremia, where they started doing too much and becoming hyperhydrated. And this was caused deaths because of this. Our new recommendation, what I encourage and what most folks will encourage, is that you individualize fluid based on sweat rate. And I will show you that coming up, how to calculate sweat rate. As a matter of fact, while I'm thinking about that, there is a fluid calculation assignment with this chapter. And I don't know if I've set the date on that. I'll have to go back and look at the module to see when that due date is. And we'll end up probably going over some of this in class. So, but just know that there is an assignment with this. And so then total fluid needs will include your baseline needs plus what you're going to be doing before, during, and after exercise. But during your exercise, the best way to do this is to determine your sweat rate and use that as a starting point for determining how much fluid you need during. Because, you might get away with doing 4 ounces every 15 minutes. You might be doing 20 ounces an hour, and that's max. So it's just really up to us to figure out, and what you would want to do is to, based on the conditions you're going to compete in, you would want to do a sweat rate test in those conditions. If I know my event's going to be in a hot, humid environment, and I'm training in the summer here, say in Arkansas, then I need to do a sweat rate test. And I've done this before, where I've lost 2, 3, 4 pounds easy in a workout. That's going to be different if I'm training in California, where there's low, temperature is mild and the humidity is low. I'm not going to be sweating as much. So you need to redo those calculations if you're changing. So it makes it a little bit of a challenge, but the test is not hard to do, at least to get you a starting point. Then you can work from there instead of just giving a blanket 8 to 10 ounces every 15 minutes. That's not going to work for most people. So we're going to individualize that. And then I think you probably already know this, Water versus sports drink. Because this is a question you'll get a lot. What are you going to do? Say less than an hour. Water or sports drink? Oh, come on, type it in. Play with me here. Type in the chat. Who thinks it's water? Who thinks it's sports drink? Type in the chat. Gay says sports drink if it's less than an hour. Do you guys remember our last chapter, our last test? Carolyn says water. Yes. Carolyn is correct. Now, here's the thing. If it's an intense hour, then you could consider it. But remember the guideline. Anything under an hour is 0 to, what is it, 0 to 30 grams of carbohydrate. So you really don't need any calories because you usually have plenty of carbohydrate on board if you're going less than an hour. If it's an intense hour, okay, then maybe. But in general, less than an hour, water's probably the best. Greater than an hour, you can certainly consider sports drink, in particular if you're going an hour and a half or more for those long workouts. Then yeah, you could do that. But in general, water is going to be, and again, it depends on your goal, right? If you're trying to lose weight and control that, then water definitely is the best choice, especially if it's less than an hour. Okay. So then what do you do after exercise? I don't know if there are any athletic trainers in the class or here with us, but I don't know if you guys, if y'all do pre and post body weights. Anybody ever do that? Like you weigh yourself before and then after exercise? Anybody do that? This is the best way to know how to rehydrate because the guidelines are you're going to replace every pound that you lose with 2 to 3 cups. So 2 to 3 cups of fluid for every pound lost. And again, you might be surprised, but some of these, say, big football linemen could lose up to 8 to 10 pounds. That's a lot, right? So you're talking about if, say, we lose 8 pounds in a workout times 2 cups, right? That's 16 cups of fluid. Okay. That's a lot. Now, you don't have to replace this immediately. Here's the thing too, right? You can replace this over the hours after your workout. It's not something you have to just automatically start to go chug 16 cups of water. I wouldn't recommend that, but you get the idea. And you know, a lot of times it's going to be more like maybe you lose a pound, maybe you lose 2, but in a hot, I guess it was this summer, I went out and ran just to do a sweat rate test, just to see. And I think I lost about 3 or 4 pounds because it was so hot and humid. Again, that was pretty extreme. And I don't know that I'd be exercising and doing an event, right, a competition at that temperature and humidity, but just to see how much I lost. And if you've never done it before, it's interesting to see. And if your workout is light, you might lose half a pound. And again, this all plays into the calculation of sweat rate that we're going to show you here shortly. Everybody okay with this? So we talked about the recommendation before, which is 5 to 10 milliliters of fluid per kilogram of body weight. We talked about during, which is really more individualized and should be based on a sweat rate test. And then post-exercise is 2 to 3 cups of fluid for every pound lost. Everybody good with that? Yes, no? Okay, got a quiet group today. Yeah, that or my computer's slow. Nobody's Nobody's chatting it up with me. There you go. Thank you, Tucker. And so here's another question that you're going to get around hydration or dehydration, in that you get this a lot, like, oh, I'm drinking my coffee here, and that coffee is going to cause you to be dehydrated. Well, I looked up, if you're familiar with our nutrition organization, Academy of Nutrition Dietetics, they have what's called an evidence library that you can go onto and look up common questions. And so I did this, and this has been some time ago. I should probably look up to see if they've updated it, but I don't know that they would have. But it basically asked that question: does coffee, tea, soft drinks cause dehydration? And the results were that consuming up to 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilogram of body weight per day doesn't impact hydration status. So if you were to do the math, or you take your body and get it into kilograms and multiply by 6, that's how many milligrams you would want to be under. Like, that'd be the max for you. And it's really, for me, it'd be probably like 500 or something. I don't know. We could do that. So take your weight in pounds. So if I'm 160 pounds, let's see, I've got my calculator over here. Let's see if I can find it and pull it up real quick. So if I'm 160 pounds divided by 2.2, that's 72.2 equals 72.2 kg. Everybody with me? And then 72.2 times 6 times 6, 436 milligrams. And that's really what, 2, 3, 4 cups of coffee, something like that. If you go to Starbucks, it's probably just one Starbucks coffee. They make it pretty strong. So it's not as much as, actually you can get away with more than what you think. And I always count my fluid intake. If you're counting fluid, I do count my coffee, because coffee's mainly water. It's got obviously lots of caffeine in there, but it's water. So I'm counting that. Same thing with my Coke Zeros and Diet Cokes. I take a little heat for that, but that's usually what I drink. I rarely, anybody with me in the chat, I rarely drink straight water, and I need to do more of that, but I just never have. I'm not saying that's the best. No, yeah, the same way. Do as I say, not as I do, one of those things. Which I like to drink more water, yes. But always something about the taste. It doesn't have any taste to it. It doesn't have any flavor. It's just plain. And again, I got to get used to that. But all right. So yes, you can get away with having some caffeine, having your soft drinks and tea and coffee, and it counts towards your hydration. It's not going to lead to dehydration unless you're consuming more than 6 milligrams per kg. Everybody okay with that piece? The before, during, and after. And so the next part of this then gets into the heat and humidity. And we always know this, being from Arkansas, this, that they always say it's not the heat, it's the humidity. Right now they come up with all kinds of, and y'all can help me out with this. What do they call it? You got the heat index. What other terms they use? I hear some things talk about the real feel. What's the real feel? Like what it really feels like outside? There are probably other measures, but when we talk about the heat index, it's the heat and the humidity that really causes the problem. And we know that there are risks associated with heat-related illnesses, and dehydration goes up in these hot and humid environments. And so here's the takeaway, is that when the temperature outside or the ambient temperatures exceed the body temperature, your ability to dissipate heat is reduced. And remember that when you sweat, it's not the sweat that cools you. What is it? Somebody type in the chat. Oh, Ella says UV index. Okay. Yeah, they have all kinds of terms now. It's not the sweat that cools us. What is it? Help me out. It's not the sweat that cools us. It's what? Oh, come on. You know this. Just the sweat on your skin does not cool you. What actually causes the cooling? Anybody? Now, the vapor, okay, or it's the evaporation of that sweat when it leaves your skin. Okay. And so, but think about what happens if the humidity is, because humidity is what? What, somebody tell me what's that mean, humidity? What is that? Yeah, it's the moisture in your, and I could have said it better. It's exactly what I was getting ready to type. It's the moisture in the air. And so when that moisture in the air is greater than the moisture on your skin, then it doesn't evaporate. And what it ends up doing is it ends up just rolling off your skin. And that's when you get into trouble. When it starts to roll off instead of evaporate. So when it starts to roll, that's when you need to be worried. If you're out exercising, you see you got athletes out there, and you notice that there's not evaporating, this sweat's just rolling off, and it's not evaporating. Then that over time that can cause some problems. So precautions should be taken under these conditions if they're extreme. And so you obviously want to start out well hydrated, have access to fluids, and then monitor the signs of heat-related illness. And it doesn't take long for people to be out there to start causing problems, especially if they go into their workouts, whether it be football 2-a-days, whether it be, soccer practice in the summer, going into these workouts hydrated, and then making sure they're hydrating during the exercise and they're stopping to take breaks. And, things have changed since my day and before, where, if you drank fluids during your workout, it was a sign of weakness. That makes no sense nowadays, right? We know better than that. When you know better, you can do better. And this is why the athletic trainers oftentimes will take charge of these situations and be responsible for making sure that athletes are having access to fluids and consuming fluids during their training sessions and their practices, right? And then they're there to monitor athletes if they have signs of heat-related illness. Because like I said, it could go down a hill pretty quick. And so what you can do as well to avoid all of this, and this, is just don't, it makes it sound simple, right? Just schedule your workouts early in the morning, late in the evening, and avoid the hottest times of the day. There may be times when, say, football teams, instead of they had planned on practicing a full practice, but because of the temperatures and all the things, they just may practice in shoulder pads and shorts, right? Because the clothes that you wear will also have an effect, and the uniforms. I tend to think about football. I tend to think about even things like the marching band, right? They're out practicing all these uniforms, or the military, out doing their whether it be their exercise or whether it be their formations and their practice, whether they do, all the gear that they wear is hot and heavy, and it can make things worse. So, or maybe going indoors. And I've heard a lot of stories about, and you guys can tell me, y'all can tell me, the indoor practice facility here at UCA, right? Someone told me that there's not really, and I think I've been in there, it's been years ago, but like there's no air conditioning. There may be now. Is there air conditioning in the indoor facility, or is it just fans? So you got AC or fans. I think when I was in there, it was just fans, which can help a little, but it's still pretty warm in there. It's better than being outside in 100 degrees in the summer here in Arkansas. But again, you just need to be careful. Or, you practice at night under the lights. So there are ways to get around this. Or for us, like most general exercisers, if you typically exercise outside, just find a treadmill indoors or a bike indoors, or, do a different activity. Weight train indoors instead of going outside. Okay. And here's an interesting thing that you may or may not know, and let me know if you've heard this before, but sometimes people, when they sweat, they think, oh, this is a bad thing, and that's a sign of being unfit. But actually, people that are fitter and more well-trained sweat sooner and they sweat more. So the fitter you are, the more you sweat, and the quicker you start to sweat, because your body is tuned to trying to keep itself cool, and that's one of the first things it does is start to sweat. Like typically, if I go outside, within the first mile, I'm sweating. Other people less fit, it might take them longer. And yes, greater losses of fluids and electrolytes via sweating, so that needs to be a consideration as you're hydrating during your exercise. And some of you may be, anybody like me, the heavy sweater. Just say, yeah, that's me, heavy sweater. And the ladies don't sweat, right? The ladies glisten. Is that right? Is that what I hear? Like perspire. I don't even know if you want to say perspire. The ladies, they're glistening a little bit. But in general, what we see is that now, this is what you'll see in the book, that losses of more than 2% of body weight will negatively impact performance. It really does depend on the individual. If you have some untrained people and you find that they're dehydrated and they've lost 2%, then yeah, it probably will. But here's what I've found, and you can probably read up on this more, is that some of the fittest people, the winners of some of these big races, are also the most dehydrated, if you were to measure that. But part of that is just the training. Their body has adapted to be able to withstand those losses in fluids better than unfit people or less fit people. But in the book, they'll say, okay, you don't want to lose any more than 2% of your body weight, which is pretty hard in most cases. And then they also will say, if you're like 3% or more, you might end up, needing medical attention. And again, really, it depends on the individual. But if you were to really look this up with some of these elite, like say marathoners, and at the end of their event, they're going to be probably way more than 2% dehydrated. They're going to be more than 2% of their body weight lost in fluid, if you were to measure. But this can happen. It depends if it's, is it 3%? Is it 5%? It's going to be individualized, but it can happen. Getting people out into situations where they're at risk. And I know this is a long time ago, and it's happened since then, not in Chicago, but in a variety of different places. And the Chicago Marathon, anybody heard of the Chicago Marathon? Anybody know what month Chicago Marathon happens? You may know somebody who got into Chicago. Yeah, so the Chicago Marathon happens in October, which it was just a couple of weeks ago, I think it happened. but for 23. But way back in 2007, when you think of Chicago in October, what do you think of? It's a windy city, right? But in October, you probably think of, cold. Yeah, cool, exactly. In October in Chicago up north, yeah, pretty cool. But this year, in 2007, it was anything but. It was like in the 90s. And because the race directors and the people responsible for the race didn't pay attention to the weather, and they didn't think about all the things and how much extra fluid people would need, they ran out of fluid. And the Chicago Marathon has, I don't know, 50,000 people. I don't know. It's close to that if it's not. So imagine how much fluid and how much they're drinking at each of these aid stations, especially if it's hot. And because they ran out of fluid, they ended up canceling the race. And they told them to walk back to Grant Park, which was kind of a big park there in Chicago. I don't know if that's the starting point but they basically said, walk back because the race is canceled. And of course, you get people out there, they're not going to want to stop. So a lot of people were struggling, sitting on the side of the road. They were turning on fire hydrants. I mean, this is images from the actual event. But you get these racers out there and they're going to want to finish. So canceling an event like that is a little bit of a challenge when you've got that many people, especially a bunch of type A's. And you see people were coming out and giving water out on the course from their homes. There was just a lot of people that were struggling. And guess who gets the worst of it? It's the people that are the middle of the pack, back of the pack racers. Because by the time they get to the aid station, there's no water because the faster people have already consumed it. And there were hundreds of people that went to the medical tent. And I think there were like 3 or 4 people that died during this event. So it can certainly happen. This is why anytime you're participating in a team sport as well as an individual sport like this, you have to take care of yourself. You have to be able to watch the signs and symptoms of heat-related illness, because it can sneak up on you quick. I mean, even for us, I've been in situations, my first Hotter Than Hell 100. Anybody heard of that? Hotter Than Hell 100? It's a bike ride in Wichita Falls, Texas. It's the largest 100-mile bike ride. Largest 100-mile bike ride in the U.S. in Wichita Falls, Texas. And this year it was really hot. I didn't do it this year, but it was super hot this year, as you can imagine. And basically one of the first times my wife and I did it, there were people and I'll stop sharing for a second. There were people out there where the bike course rode. We rode past these rural roads, and there were people that lived out there that weren't happy with all these thousands of bikers going past their homes. So what they did is they turned the signs so it diverted us the wrong way. So we actually, and Jamie and I, my wife, we usually don't start with a big group. We'll drive and park a little ahead of all the thousands of people to get out in front of them. So we start early because it usually takes us a little longer anyway, but we just get out of the fray and don't start with a big group. The first 1,000 or so people, we went the wrong way. And so we were pedaling, and I'm like, we're running out. We ran out of bottles on our bike, and we were pedaling like the aid station's got to be right up here. It's got to be right over the next hill. Sure enough, we got on the next hill, there was nothing. And eventually found out that someone had sabotaged the race and turned the signs a different way. So that year, I think we ended up riding 110 miles instead of 110. But we ended up getting to a place to stop. Someone had drove their truck up there and basically let us know that, hey, we're going the wrong way. And a lot of people just took the option of jumping in the back of a truck and being hauled to the start line, and their day was done. We were probably at about mile 70 or 80. We could have done that, but we're hard-headed, but we were struggling because there was no fluid, and people were bringing us fluid out. I think it was like some closed old convenience store or something where we ended up stopping. But just know that if you get out there, you got to be able to take care of yourself, and those types of things can happen. Okay. So this next little section, then, we've talked about the dehydrating and being underhydrated or hypohydrated. The other end of the spectrum is doing too much water and being hyperhydrated, and the condition is called hyponatremia. Basically, what it means is water intoxication. That's another term for it. Water intoxication. And it all relates to sodium levels, because we know importance of sodium, potassium, and all these electrolytes, particular sodium. When you consume too much fluid, either you're consuming it too much of it or you're consuming it too rapidly, it depletes your sodium. And so when your sodium range is under like 130 millimole per liter, it's considered hyponatremic. And most often this occurs when someone's exercising for a prolonged time and they're just drinking water. So when you go for a really long time, especially in the heat, you should always be consuming something with some electrolytes in it. And also preferably some carbohydrate too, right? Some simple sugar, like your sports drink. But usually what happens is, that's what was happening to a lot of these marathoners, these middle of the pack, back of the packers. They were out there for 5, 6, 7 hours doing a marathon, and they were trying to drink 40 ounces of fluid an hour, and it was straight water, and they ended up being hyponatremic, which can lead to death. An example of, say, a non-exercise, some of you may have heard this before. I tell this in all my classes, this story. Anybody heard of the radio contest? Where the person died? Yeah, so it was called Hold Your, is this how I spell it? I don't know. We to win a we. Is that how you spell those old gaming systems? So basically, I had people at this radio station, and they started drinking like, I don't know, 16 ounces every 15 minutes or something. And the first one to go to the bathroom, if you went to the bathroom, you were out. So people were trying to hold their wee, if you will. And the lady who won the contest, and she won the gaming system, ended up going home and dying from hyponatremia because they were drinking straight water. And people were calling in the show, warning them, but they didn't listen. They kept on. So I'm pretty sure that radio station got sued because there was no excuse for that. But it can happen. It rarely happens, but it is a thing. But it's for people that exercise for a really long time, and typically they're drinking just straight water, and maybe they're drinking a lot of it. Maybe they're drinking it really fast. And the problem with this, when you look at the symptoms, they're similar to symptoms that you might experience if you're dehydrated: nausea and vomiting, headache, confusion, loss of energy and fatigue, muscle weakness. All of this is something similar you might see if you were dehydrated. So sometimes it's hard to know without getting the full story on an individual of what they might need. But so it can be a real thing. Rarely seen in strength and power athletes, again, because you're typically not over drinking and you're just hydrating and fueling during half times and timeouts and things like that. Most of the time, it's commonly seen for in endurance athletes who are drinking too much. And you hear the goal, drink to thirst. But here's what and that's what you probably have heard, right? You have heard that if you're thirsty, what? Finish my sentence. You're already dehydrated. Okay. And there's some truth to that. But what I would suggest is you use both of these. So you do your sweat rate test plus listen to thirst a little bit. Don't just listen to your thirst. Okay. That you have a plan. Okay. When you combine those two, that's usually the best approach. Okay. That's usually the best. Okay. So let's do this. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. Because the next piece to this is to actually how to determine your sweat rate. And we'll do that next time. We'll come back. We'll do a little quick review of this. We'll do your sweat rate test. We may also talk about your fluid calculations assignment. I'll pull that up. But then also maybe the very beginning of class, I will talk about your athlete profile because I want to get that done and make sure everybody's on the same page with your athlete profile. So we'll do athlete profile first. I'll have all that information pulled up on the screen. Then we'll do your sweat rate calculations and then also talk about that fluid calculation. So if you want to download that, bring it next time, that'd be great. Other than that, I will work on, thanks for letting me know that I didn't even catch that I hadn't opened the section. I should have already opened that. I'll get all the dates and all the timing down for the chapters. I don't know that I've done that for the quizzes and assignments and things. So I'll set dates on those and we'll be set to go. And again, if I'm missing something, please let me know because lots of stuff going on and we're doing this remotely. So it's a little bit of a challenge. Keep me honest. All right. So that's it for today. Any questions? I will post this in the live class section and we'll see you next time. All right. Have a great day. Have a great, happy Halloween. All right. Bye.